And welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. It's time for our interview on Monday Special, and you can get in touch with us using the hashtag Monday Special KE if you're online, and we would love to read from you. And also, of course, via text 22422 is our SMS line. As I mentioned earlier, we were to host this evening NASA co-principal Musalia Mudavadi, who was to speak about the NASA Manifesto. He declined to come, but we do have in his stead the NASA technical advisor, David D, and you're welcome to the program. Very quickly, I would like you to give us the general rationale or the guiding principle for the NASA Manifesto before we look at it in bullet form.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I think apologies for Juan Musalia that he couldn't come. I just spoke not too long ago. He had many things to do. If you look at the NASA Manifesto, it's titled Strong Nation. It is called Strong Nation because we are starting from the point that we say we are a fragile nation. So we are approaching an election, and people are very scared whether the election will be safe or not. So a country which has been a multi-party country for now the 6th election, almost as long as we were a single-party state actually, that has only had one successful democratic election, which was considered free, fair and credible, means that we are probably always one election away from civil strife. So we are, if you look at the NASA Manifesto, it says that there's obviously something wrong with that situation, and we say that we have not built a strong political foundation for this country. Okay.
Let me hold you there so that we can get into the general overview of the NASA Manifesto. And we're just going to pull this up for our audience very quickly. Of course, this doesn't capture everything that is in the manifesto, but certainly would be the highlights of it. Let's see what they had to say about devolution. So NASA is now promising 500,000 low-cost affordable homes, counties urbanization project. That will be a county's urbanization project. On economy, some of the key things that the NASA Manifesto is promising. 10% GDP growth annually, single-digit inflation, prudent management of public debt, low interest rates, improved tax collection, and we'll be going through this point by point. Let's move on to food security. NASA is promising to construct county food storage silos, promote maize and cash crops, avail seed and fertilizer to farmers. On the issue of governance and accountability, NASA is promising no conflict of interest when it comes to, bidding for government contracts, appointees and principals to sign a code of conduct, a zero-tolerance policy on corruption, and an NIS surveillance department to monitor the same. On the question of housing, of course, we touched on this earlier with the counties, the affordable low-cost homes as part of the urbanization project. And finally, on infrastructure. To concentrate on county and rural roads, high-speed commuter rail within Nairobi, construct the Moyale, Mandera, Wajergais road, and the construction of the Likoni Bridge. Of course, this is just in snapshot, but what I would like to focus on this program will be the items that are not absolutely clear in terms of how the coalition intends to achieve it should they get into power, and I'll also focus on what the promises that you have been campaigning on, and a big one has been campaigning on the platform of reform and anti-corruption. NASA principals have alleged that the current administration is one of the most corrupt administrations that the country has had, but the manifesto appears vague in terms of the specific issues that you would do in order to end corruption. Perhaps you can elaborate on how exactly your zero-tolerance policy on corruption would work.
Let me first just point out something, that I've seen a lot of things you have pointed out there, and they are not in the NASA Manifesto.
Where are they from?
I think you must have seen a documentary, it's an implementation program or something like that. It's not the NASA Manifesto. The NASA Manifesto has no projects.
Fair enough. So let's get to
so
now.
I just want to highlight that.
On the specifics now,
yeah.
on the question of corruption, what is your zero tolerance policy?
I think you need to first of all clear what zero tolerance is. Zero tolerance simply means you don't tolerate. Okay? You don't tolerate yourself. So that has nothing to do with how all the institutional arrangements in the country and all those things work. So that is a commitment saying, we, as somebody says, I will not tolerate corruption. So if you look at how we have translated that, we have said that the main reason why we have such a high tolerance for corruption in Kenya, because we have a very high social tolerance of corruption. Society tolerates it.
It's because?
It is because of the culture of impunity. The culture of impunity is because the corrupt people are protected by the highest offices in the land. Okay? So if the highest people in the highest offices in the land, the presidency for instance, is the one which protects corrupt people, there is no institution that can function. Okay? Because what those people are able to do is subvert institutions. Okay? We are talking about a country which 5 years ago, we wrote a constitution 7 years ago with a chapter on integrity. Then when it came to the election, we threw that chapter out of the window. Okay? So, if you're going to talk about forming government, corruption has many dimensions. It has a moral ethical dimension at a societal level. In organizations, it's ethical norms in an organization. In this organization has a code of conduct for staff and employees. If you violate it, you're fired. Okay? Then you have the criminal justice dimension. What we have done in Kenya is make everything corruption as if it's about criminal justice. So that in government, there are very many things where the threshold of people being dismissed for unethical behavior exists. So there are very many people you could send home for unethical behavior. But we say, no, you are only punished if you are taken to court and you are found guilty. And
isn't that what due process and common sense requires, that one ought to be found
No,
guilty?
Because no, that's a point. We have conflated everything about corruption as if it's a criminal offense. Most corrupt things are not criminal offenses. If you talk to the things which are done in government,
for instance, sir.
Oh, there are many things which are not criminal.
Give me an example.
There are many things which are not
corruption,
criminal,
but it's not criminal.
Oh, they're not criminal. Nepotism. Nepotism is a huge chunk of corruption. Yeah? Fundamentally, what does corruption mean? But let's not go into that. The point is, by the time you're talking about people being taken to court for fraud, for instance, let's say the things which are not criminal offenses. The other thing is that there's a whole lot of things which we'll call corruption, which are penal code offenses. So this time, most of the things we call corruption is actually fraud. Fraud is a penal code offense. Theft by servant, all sorts of things.
So in your zero tolerance of the same...
Zero tolerance to corruption means, if we have said that we are going to have a NASA code of conduct. If you go to the NASA coalition agreement, it has a code of conduct. And that code of conduct talks about if anybody is found culpable, they're required to resign. So they don't have to go to jail.
Fair enough. Let's talk about also the, beyond the moral shadowy areas which you've talked about that will be covered by your code of conduct. There are of course the blatantly criminal elements, and one of the challenges, at least this administration has claimed, has been in the larger criminal justice system, where either you have shoddy investigations or you do not have courts letting people out on major offenses with a slap on the wrist sort of thing. How would NASA address such an issue?
I want to go back to the previous issue because you're belittling it.
I'm not belittling it, I'm moving on.
The fundamental corruption problem in this country, one of the most fundamental, is conflict of interest of people in government who also have business interests. And they are making decisions which benefit their business interests. Okay? That worldwide is the biggest type of thing which is seen as corruption, which is not very tangible, that you can actually be able to point out and send somebody to court. So the things you're talking about, fraud, where people have stolen money directly, those people should be fired because you have stolen, and then you go and fight for yourself.
Yes.
The fundamental ones is conflict of interest, people doing business with government directly, okay, who are in government. Those are the things you said. People in NASA will not do business with government.
And I think that's clear. Moving on to the point of the state agencies, because if should NASA take government, then of course it would be in charge of all these state agencies would be operating under NASA administration. And one of the issues that you have taken exception with as a NASA coalition is the operations of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, saying that it has basically become a laundromat, if you like, to clear the corrupt. So what would you do specifically to reform such institutions?
Those are constitutional bodies.
What would you do to reform them?
You do not
strengthen them.
You do not. First of all, it's very simple. I said impunity. Leave them alone to work. Do not interfere. If you look at the anti-corruption agencies Kenya, it has a succession of one of the seems the most important thing for the presidency or the executive is to have control of who is the CEO of that organization or who is the chairperson of that organization. Those organizations, that's why, are designed to have autonomy. And that's what I said. If the biggest offices in the land want to protect their people, then they are going to subvert those institutions. If, as the president or the presidency or the government, you do not want to protect your people who are corrupt, you are not going to subvert those institutions. So it's not about what you're going to do.
So because
it's about desisting from meddling so that they can serve your purpose.
And yet you have complained about the manner in which EACC is operating. Therefore, you would make no changes? And NASA government would make no changes?
Look, if institutions, one of the most things you have to do, and we have made that very clear, our main platform is implementing the Constitution. And the Constitution envisages certain independent institutions. The DPP, we work with the people who brought about the new Constitution, the judiciary, all those autonomous agencies. The most important thing is to build the institutions, to make them work, not to make the institutions agencies of the executive.
And so in building them, what would you specifically do?
Respect the constitutions. Constitutions are there to be obeyed. So once you pass a constitution, you obey it. You swear to obey the Constitution. When you start meddling with independent institutions, you're violating the Constitution.
Okay, a final question in this so that we can move away from the institutions. Would a NASA administration push for the removal of the current leadership of EACC?
I don't think you want to focus on personalities because you're already meddling. If there are processes of how people should be removed, those processes are already specified.
Okay, so you would do that?
You follow the law. You know rule of law? You do what the law says.
All right. At the same time, it appears that NASA and Jubilee are engaging in a kind of battle as to who has more corrupt officials in their camp. For a coalition that prides itself on being reformist, being anti-graft, would you not say that the current banter is a very low threshold for yourselves, that zero tolerance would mean that even the people at the table within NASA should be above reproach?
I don't think that we are the ones who are doing it, but let me take you back. In 2003, we had a coalition called NAC. We had been fighting Kanu. I was part of the opposition fighting Kanu. By the time we formed NAC, half the people came from Kanu. Okay? So we had the people like George Saitoti and others who came from Kanu. But NAC was a very strong reform coalition platform. So if you focus on personalities, William Timama, people we had been fighting for decades. But when they became to NAC on a reform platform, they actually became very reformist. So
what you're saying is that you have inherited corrupt officials from previous administrations and that now it's fine?
No. I'm saying the following. Again, you're talking about issues or personalities. We're saying, if you say that in this country, we have admitted, and we say it all the time, that corruption is a societal problem. We even say that corruption is a cancer. If corruption is a societal problem, if you take the country and divide people into two, and you draw them any which way into two groups, half the groups the two groups will have an equal proportion of corrupt people.
But would a zero-tolerance policy then mean that from the very onset, those who are part of the NASA coalition, whether sitting in technical committees such as yours or the very top leadership of it, would not be by any means touched by even, you know, the moral...
I don't think you have understood. No, that is not what zero tolerance means.
It's not about understanding. It's about asking.
Zero, no. Zero tolerance.
Yeah.
You are talking about individuals that, and making moral judgments about individuals. We are not in government. Zero tolerance means when you fight corruption, you are fighting corruption. Why do you use the language of fight? You are fighting something where you are. It's a war against where you are. So angels are not going to come from out there and all of a sudden you have a clean government. What happens is that there will be people among you who will do corruption. This is Kenya. Zero tolerance means if people are corrupt, you will let them go. You will not protect them for months. You will not see the government fighting parliament when parliament is trying to investigate people. You will not find NASA government subverting processes to defend corrupt people who have done corruption when they are in your government.
Okay.
That's what zero tolerance means.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you go look for, you dig into people's pasts and you say, okay, these ones are clean, these ones are not. You're saying, we are going into government. You don't, you're saying you are inclusive. You're inclusive. If we had done that in 2003, they said, okay, all of you Kanu people stay out. Okay.
That's interesting, because you're talking about not going into people's past, because in your manifesto you talk about going into the past, correcting historically incorrect narratives on Kenya's history. What exactly does that phrase mean? Do you mean to rewrite history, and in what way has the narrative by previous regimes been incorrect?
We're talking about the transitional justice process, which was aborted, for instance. If you read the beginning part of that paragraph, it says that a country which is not at peace with its past cannot be at peace with its present or its future. What we have in this country is people with many historical grievances as individuals and as communities about injustices that have been inflicted on them. Let's talk about individuals. There are many people in this country who suffered from detention without trial, from all sorts of things, for political persecution. Many of them have been awarded, they were fighting for the democracy we enjoy. Some of them have been awarded, they were going to court, they've been awarded redress or whatever by the courts, they've not been paid. Yeah? So we have not been acknowledged that they were wronged. We even refused to pay them. If you talk about communities, I cannot go to the list of communities and issues that are there in the TGRC about communities with grievances we have not recognized. So it's about political healing. That's what it's about. It's about when you have those kind of injustices, people distort history because they don't want the history to reflect that. If you try and get the correct history of the Wagala massacre, they are like the state story, there is the community story, and these are things that other communities, societies have gone about. South Africa went through a very elaborate process to come out of its injustices of apartheid and all of that. These are issues which people feel very strongly about. These are issues, if we do not resolve, you see them bubbling under the surface. So if you're going to create a cohesive society, you're going to have processes which are continuously addressing these issues. Okay,
just before we move on to economy, the manifesto also talks about ending extrajudicial killings, torture, rendition, and disappearances. How will you do so within the police service? Do you intend an overhaul of the current police service leadership, and how do you intend to determine officers who have been guilty of this?
That is not rocket science. Those are human rights abuses. They are against the Constitution.
So you intend to overhaul the...
No.
That's my question.
There are things you do not do. Those things are done because you have a government which tolerates them. Those are value things. If you value human rights, if you respect the Bill of Rights of your Constitution, your security institutions will not do that. We have mechanisms already. We have the Police Service Commission, we have the Oversight Commission. Those bodies are actually sufficient to deal with those cases. The problem is you have too much abuse, which is abetted, and in fact very often policy of the government. If you go to the part where we're talking about governance, we are saying we are going to be a government which embraces human rights.
All right.
What we have now is a government which abuses human rights.
So as it stands right now, because you're talking about extrajudicial killings which would then allegedly be taking place currently, what is your restitution mechanism for the same should you be elected on August 8th? You know,
our constitution has got about 5 or 6, 7 clauses which talks about participation. Participatory processes. Your role as the government is to set those processes in motion. Once you set those processes in motion, you create the structures, whether it's tribunals, whether it's commissions of inquiry, whether it's whatever bodies. Once you set them up as prescribed by the Constitution, they then give them authority.
So you set up a tribunal?
That's what you do as policy. If you are a government which recognizes and embraces human rights, this is part of the work of governing on a day-to-day basis.
Fair enough, but it's not stated implicitly in your manifesto, which is why we're clarifying. So you've said you'll set up an inquiry on the same.
No, I did not say I'll set up an inquiry. I said very clearly, there are mechanisms in the Constitution, in governance norms, about how you deal with things like that. We don't have to invent them.
Yes, so what we say we will opting for?
A manifesto is not an operations manual. It's a statement of objectives.
But there must be a game plan.
No, the processes are there. Read the Constitution.
Let's move on to the question of the economy and unemployment, and you've campaigned very heavily on the question of public debt. In the manifesto, NASA pledges to, quote, return the country to a path of sustainable borrowing with a budget deficit not exceeding 3% of GDP. So how will you do so? How will you achieve that?
You do 3 things. One, if you're in a hole, you should stop digging. So one of the things you do is contain the excessive borrowing. A very reckless borrowing for projects with dubious returns. 2, the structure of our debt has changed very badly in the time of Jubilee. We've moved from cheap loans to expensive loans, from long-term to short-term, from concessionary from donors to commercial from banks. So they have all moved in the wrong direction. So you need to start moving those back so that you have the right mix of debt to bring down the cost of debt. Thirdly, given the cost burden that we already have, you need to find ways or you can grow the economy very rapidly, the productive economy, because Jubilee has not been growing the productive economy. They've been building infrastructure with debt. That's what we are calling growth. So you need to move from debt financed, deficit financed expansion to production financed expansion.
All right, let's break down your answer into piecemeal, because you've talked about stop digging the hole. So does that mean cancelling existing loan agreements?
No, no, you don't. You just don't enter into new ones at the rate that Jubilee is entering.
Okay, so you won't enter into others. The national debt already stands at approximately
4 billion.
3 trillion. 3 trillion is the figure that we have.
It's 4 trillion.
That is your figure. If NASA wins, you of course would inherit this debt. How would it be repaid?
Debt, you repay the debt. It's a first charge on public money. So if you have incurred debt, you pay it. There are no 2 ways about it.
So it's a sustainable repayment?
No, you have to pay. You borrowed, unless you default.
You'd have to borrow to pay?
No, you have debt. When you do your budget, the first thing you provide for is money to pay debt. So what's happened in Jubilee is because they've borrowed and the amount of debt service has increased so much. It is becoming, it is eating into the money, for instance, for giving doctors and nurses and teachers better pay. That's why they are on strike all the time.
So how you will do it differently is...
Well, once you've got that kind of crisis, that's why if you look when you're talking about putting the country on a path, a path is not something you are doing or going to do on a one-day basis. So you've got to do a macroeconomic framework, which you look at growth. For instance, one of the things you're going to have to try and do very quickly, which can bring down your cost, is the cost of domestic debt, interest. Because if you slow down on the kind of domestic borrowing that Jubilee is doing, a huge appetite for money, then you probably will be able to bring domestic interest rates down. Now, the domestic debt is 2 trillion shillings. 1 percentage point bringing it down is 20 billion shillings. So if you bring it down by 3 percentage points over maybe a period of a year, you're saving yourself 60 billion.
And
so
you would do
there are
that
very many
by slowing down on local borrowing.
No, you do many things. You substitute, you lengthen maturity. It's a technical subject.
Be our guest.
Yeah, that's my training. I'm a macroeconomist. That's what I've done all my life.
Go ahead and explain.
So I think for some of the things, the short-term debt is very expensive because it rolls over very quickly. So you try and lengthen maturity. But macroeconomically, you need to start to reduce your appetite for money. So that you don't signal the market and then you're pushing interest rates up. You need to look at whether you are able to move more, as I said, back to borrowing concessional money from the World Bank and the FDBs instead of borrowing syndicated loans.
And over what period do you
this is taking 3 to 5 years.
Within 3 to 5 years you'd be able to...
No, you probably, you can't do it overnight. I mean, the damage has already been done. You can't undo it overnight, yeah.
Fair enough. I want to move quickly to what the manifesto refers to as crony capitalism, where economic policies are focused on the wealthy, dictating the kind of infrastructure projects, etc., that go on in the country. How would you reverse this or end this? Does this mean cancelling existing contracts?
This is not about government. This is about the economy. So let me give you an example. You take a sector like dairy sector, okay, where you have dominant monopoly, okay? It's dominant monopoly, a monopolistic entrepreneur. So this, because of monopoly power, which is state supported, you have a private entity which buys milk at 30 shillings from the farmer, sells it to the consumers at 80 shillings, so you've got a 50 shilling margin. Now that 50 shilling margin, where does it go? It goes to protect political power so that you can have more monopoly. That's what crony capitalism is. So what do we do? What you do is that you develop, if you go where we're coming from, you develop an industry and move to an industry which is owned by farmers. Now, how did the farmers lose the industry that they used to own, the industry? The answer is in the question. It's because people who control state power have been able to drive the farmer-owned KCC and other institutions out of the daily industry.
Yet some would argue the reverse, that would be punishing legitimate business persons for their success.
I talked about conflict of interest, where in many countries and most civilized democracies, when you go into government and you have private interests, you put them in a blind trust. Or there are also mechanisms for ensuring that you cannot make decisions in government which benefit your private interests. That's what I mean by conflict of interest. So what you have in Kenya is state capture across many sectors. You look at the people, you look at the people who have influence, the people who are listened to. Yeah, who are they? You look at manufacturing. You've got a small manufacturing industry which is owned by powerful people and influential people. It employs 200,000 people. You've got a Juakali manufacturing which employs 2.7 million people. But when you look at the policy table, who sits at the policy table? Is it the Juakali people who employ 2.7 million people? Or is it the few people who employ 200,000 people who are afforded protection by the state against competition, while the little guys are exposed to competition? They are not provided with infrastructure. So state capture, that's what we mean.
All right. I want to move on to some other not very specific areas, generally in services, if you like, and you've talked about building world-class stadia, hospitals, and theatres for the arts. How many are we talking about, and within which period?
We have stated a policy statement. We are not talking projects. We have stated that we're going to support the creative economy. And the creative economy depends on the arts. But the arts in Kenya are not treated as an economic sector. So we have stated a policy that we will promote arts infrastructure to be treated at par with other economic infrastructure. So that when we talk about roads, we also talk about theatres. When we talk about hospitals, social infrastructure, we also talk about art galleries. Okay, because that infrastructure at this point in time is relegated to the backwaters. So it is not a priority. Because in Kenya, we tend to give priority to things which we think are of economic read to economic, and cultural infrastructure is very often seen as consumption. It's seen as a luxury problem for the elite. But this is the bedrock of the creative economy.
Yeah, and because I'm asking you on the specifics, the numbers, the timing, etc., and your response has been often that this is a policy document. There are those who go as far as saying that the reason why we see so many perhaps generalities in terms of the approach is that because the NASA coalition is not willing to be held account on specific numbers, on specific time frames. Within this period, you will get this job done, and it will be this amount of things done. How do you respond to that?
If you read our manifesto, it's what we call evidence-based policy making. It is not plucking projects from the air to please people. We say, in agriculture, for instance, why are we going to support smallholder agriculture? And why are we focusing on productivity of smallholder agriculture? Then we give numbers and say that in dairy, for instance, you have farmers in the same place, some with producing 2 liters per cow, and others producing 20 liters per cow. So you can raise the productivity of these 2 liters per cow farmer to 10 liters per cow farmer by doing the following. That is called evidence-based policy making. Okay? Now, if you're talking about the things you actually do, if you go into the public service, you will find people who are very knowledgeable about these things. You go to, so you say, we want to raise productivity of the dairy economy. And then you sit down, you've changed the policy direction. Your job as political leaders and whatever is to change the policy direction. The technical expertise is in government and in other areas. So the thing that the thing that Jubilee has made the habit of people prohibiting laptops and then falling flat on its face is because it was inexperienced in how you do policy. That's why they have been falling the place all over the place, because they go to government and they find, in fact, evidence does not support the things they went around telling people.
Okay. I want to move to the question of agriculture, food security, since you've taken us there, and in specific you've talked about the construction of a national water pipeline, and yet at the same time there isn't real mention of source. So where would you be tapping water for this national pipeline?
I told you that's the wrong document. That document is not our manifesto.
Something that you are promising
it's not. No, it's not in our manifesto. It is in a document that was a draft document prepared.
That was a draft. That's not part of what
as an implementation plan.
Okay.
People are beginning to put the sort of projects that would do this, and that's the way you do. You propose projects, then they are appraised. And do these projects make sense?
So a national pipeline is not
on the agenda. It is not on the agenda.
Fair enough. Let's move on to the question of land, which has been a big issue that NASA has been campaigning on, and specifically the issue of land rights. Yet we see no mention of the same in the manifesto. Is that by design?
It is there in the manifesto.
What specifically do you need
to do? If you go in your manifesto. The first part of the manifesto is called nation building. Yes. And if you go to that nation building section, there is a whole list of things which you have to do in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Okay? The question of the land issue you're talking about is dealt with in Article 64, 65 of the Bill of Rights, and it's about community land. What we did in the Constitution to deal with those issues, because these issues were dealt with in the Constitution, okay? We used to have public land and private land before. There are trust lands and all other sort of things. Community land is quite a complicated issue in Kenya. But under the Constitution, there is a provision which provides for community land and all sorts of provisions. Then the Constitution says that Parliament will enact a law to bring those community land provisions into force. That was a deal negotiated by the people of Kenya, and it has says how community land will be protected, including land which is used by hunter-gatherers and all sorts of people.
And now that various land laws are in place, are you saying these are not sufficient?
They have not.
We need to enact
laws? The Constitution says that we do, and what happened is that there was a law which was being prepared to do exactly that. When Jubilee came into power, one of the first things they did was to water down that law.
So I'm asking you what you would do. Are you saying
We
the
will
landlord's
go back.
are not sufficient?
The Constitution,
you will go back?
the Constitution is very clear. Our manifesto is about implementing the Constitution. Jubilee, if you recall, like the Deputy President led the no camp. They have not embraced implementation of the Constitution. We will implement the Constitution. There are provisions on land in the Constitution to resolve these historical injustices and land rights that have not been implemented or have actually been suppressed.
But I guess it's fair to say you'll not tell us right now how you'll implement
No, is it the Constitution? Have you read the Constitution?
Yes, apparently I
have. Please read it again.
Sir, there's no need to be curt in your responses. I'd appreciate a simple yes or no answer. A simple yes or no answer will suffice. I am listening, and if I think the answer is not sufficient, I'll ask again. That's my job, sir. I'll move on to the question of healthcare. NASA has proposed the establishment of a National Universal Health Service Fund for curative health services, and you have said that there will be a basic minimum contribution. Does this mean scrapping the current NHIF system?
No, and we actually do explain that.
Go ahead.
The NHIF is a regular private health insurance. The minimum charge for NHIF is 500 shillings a month. That's 6,000 shillings a year. It also works best with payroll deductions. That only covers 2.4 million workers. Okay? The entire workforce of Kenya is 18 million people.
So this is a parallel system.
It's not a parallel system. It is a basic system. Now, NHIF is not basic. It's a middle class. It's fundamentally a middle class system, which actually competes with the regular middle class private insurance. Because if you have a household of 2 people working and they're paying 12,000 shillings, even if it's at the low level, actually they will be paying more, you can buy fairly decent health insurance in the private market for that kind of money.
So in terms of a minimum contribution, what
Makueni has a basic one, which is more or less a model of what we are looking at. And they charge households 500 shillings a year. So we are looking at something which doesn't probably cost more than 1,000 shillings a year.
Okay.
But we are also not, what we're changing is the way that we spend the curative health budget that government already does. You're saying, instead of taking the money and giving it to hospitals to spend as they wish and wait for patients, you're taking the money, putting it into a fund, then patients go to the hospital and the hospitals build a fund.
And because
you're changing the structure.
You're not replacing NHIF, so you're saying the two would run in a NHIF operates alongside the AR, all sorts of other insurances. No, this is a base. It sits right at the bottom and makes it universal because it is affordable by everyone. When it comes into place, every Kenyan will have a card. Right now, if you look at Jubilee, for instance, they're saying that 70% of Kenyans will be covered by NHIF by 2022. What we're saying is that you put this in place, people can continue joining NHIF because NHIF is elite, it's a sort of middle class thing. So this is for the people at the rock bottom. Right.
It's not competing with NHIF or any other health insurance that exists in the market.
And I appreciate that. That was a specific answer to my question. We're going to wind up with this tweet that you posted on the 2nd of July 2017. If we have that, can we bring it up, please? Sorry, okay, it appears that it has hung, but basically in the tweet you are quoted as saying that if Uhuru Kenyatta is declared winner in another sham election, this country will burn. What did you mean by that?
I wrote that in an article about a year and a half ago, and I said if you read the whole thing, I said we are hurtling towards another election as ethnically polarized, people as angry and probably angrier than before. The institutions that should arbitrate the election are in shambles. The IEBC already was in the throes of the chicken gate. The Supreme Court was in the throes of a bribery scandal, which ended up removing one of the judges. So these are the institutions that are supposed to manage our election. First of all, IBC does the election, and if the presidential election there is a problem, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court already undermined its authority with the way it went about the previous presidential or whatever. And now you had it melting down in front